Picture this. It is a Tuesday evening. You have been sitting at the same desk for 40 minutes. Your notes are open, your highlighter is uncapped, and you have read the same paragraph 4 times without it meaning anything at all. You are not tired exactly. You are not distracted by anything specific. It is something quieter than that, a kind of dull friction between you and the page, like pushing through water. Maybe you close the tab. Maybe you get up for water you do not actually want. Maybe you just sit there and feel, in a way you would not say out loud, slightly ashamed of yourself, like something must be wrong with the way your brain works, like other people do not feel this, like you should, by now, be better at this. Here's what no one tells you. That feeling is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that you are using a learning system that was never designed for the way human beings actually think. And here's the part that matters even more. The people throughout history who became genuinely brilliant at absorbing, applying, and advancing knowledge were not exempt from that friction. They just understood something about it that changed how they worked with it. Marie Curie is a good place to start. When most people think of Marie Curie, they picture genius, inevitability, a mind so extraordinary that discovery was simply her natural state, like a bird that cannot help but fly. But that image is almost entirely constructed after the fact. It is what we do with exceptional people once they are safely historical. We flatten them. We make their greatness seem inborn so that we do not have to examine what they actually did, day by day, in ordinary rooms under difficult circumstances. The truth is more interesting and considerably more useful. Curie came to Paris from Poland with almost no money, spoke French as a second language, and was initially barred from formal scientific education because of her gender. She studied in a garret apartment so cold in winter that the water in her wash basin froze overnight. She wrote in her journals about exhaustion, about doubt, about the long silences between moments of clarity. Her notebooks from that period are still mildly radioactive, which is its own kind of metaphor. She carried her work in her body. What she possessed was not a brain wired differently from yours. What she possessed was a relationship with learning that most of us were never taught to cultivate. The myth of natural intelligence is one of the most quietly damaging ideas in modern education. It tells us that ability is fixed, that some people have it and some do not, and it creates a kind of learned helplessness that masquerades as self-awareness. We say, "I'm not a science person," or "I've never been good at reading," as though these were facts about our blood type, rather than stories we absorbed from a system that needed to sort us efficiently. The psychologist Carol Dweck spent decades documenting what happens to people who believe talent is fixed versus people who believe ability can be developed. The difference in outcomes is not small. And what is striking is not the outcomes themselves, but the internal experience. People who believe in the possibility of growth are not more confident in a shallow way. They are more honest about difficulty. They tolerate confusion better. They treat a wrong answer as information rather than indictment. Curie was not born with that orientation. She built it. There is something that learning scientists call cognitive load. The basic idea is this: your working memory, the part of your mind that holds and manipulates information in real time, has a limited capacity. It is not a flaw, it is a feature. But it means that the way you structure a study session matters enormously, because you can overwhelm the system with too much at once and process almost nothing. Think of it like a workbench. If you pile the entire contents of a warehouse onto one workbench, you cannot work effectively on any of it. But if you bring one thing to the bench at a time, work it carefully, and then integrate it into a larger understanding before moving on, you build something real. Curie's work journals show a pattern that modern cognitive science would recognize immediately. She did not multitask. She did not flit between topics to maintain novelty. She worked on a single problem for extended periods, often revisiting the same material across multiple days, allowing understanding to deepen rather than broaden prematurely.
This connects to something else we now understand about memory consolidation. The brain does not store learning the way a hard drive stores files, as a completed transfer that happens in one session. Memory is more like a garden. The initial planting is just the beginning. What determines whether something actually takes root is what happens in the hours and days afterward, particularly during sleep, and particularly when you return to the material and actively retrieve it rather than passively review it. Rereading your notes feels productive. It has the sensation of learning, but research on retrieval practice shows consistently that the act of trying to remember something, even imperfectly, even with errors, builds far stronger neural pathways than exposure alone. The struggle to recall is not a sign that you haven't learned. It is the mechanism by which learning becomes durable. Curie returned to her experiments not to see if she remembered them, but to deepen her understanding of what they meant. There is a difference.
Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. At what age did you last feel genuinely curious about something you were supposed to learn, rather than pressured to perform? The psychologist William James wrote in the late 19th century that the art of remembering is the art of thinking. What he meant was that information does not stick in isolation. It sticks when it connects to something you already care about, something that has emotional or personal relevance. Curiosity is not a luxury in learning. It is infrastructure. Curie was not simply disciplined. She was deeply, almost structurally curious. Her letters describe a quality of attention that was less about forcing herself to focus and more about following genuine fascination. The radioactive properties of pitchblende did not interest her because she was required to study them. They interested her because she encountered something in the data that did not make sense by current explanations, and that gap bothered her in a way she could not let go. That quality, the capacity to be bothered by a gap in understanding, is learnable. It is not innate. But most modern educational environments train it out of people by rewarding correct answers and penalizing visible confusion. The result is that learners become performance-oriented rather than mastery-oriented. They study to demonstrate knowledge rather than to build it. The difference shows up in how information is stored. Performance-oriented learning tends toward memorization of surface features. Mastery-oriented learning tends toward understanding of structure, the underlying logic that makes individual facts make sense. And structural understanding is both easier to retain and far more flexible to apply. There is a version of this conversation that turns into an argument for working harder, for more discipline, for eliminating distraction. That is not what this is. Because one of the subtler findings in learning science is that the brain consolidates and integrates material during periods of rest, not during distraction, not during scrolling, not during low-grade avoidance, but genuine rest. The default mode network, the brain's background processing system, is highly active when you are not focused on a task. It is during these periods that the mind makes connections, resolves contradictions, and integrates new learning with existing understanding. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journals about the importance of returning to simplicity, of not filling every hour with effort, of understanding that restraint is itself a form of strength. He was describing something that the neuroscience of the past 2 decades has begun to formalize. The fallow field is not a failed field. But there is a distinction worth making carefully and without judgment. There is rest and there is avoidance. They can feel similar from the inside. Genuine rest has a quality of settledness to it. Avoidance has a low hum of anxiety underneath it. The activity you use to avoid learning does not refresh you, it occupies you. And when you return to the desk, you feel neither rested nor ready. You feel the same friction, slightly worse, with an additional weight of guilt added to it. If you have experienced this, it is not a character flaw. It is a signal, usually a signal about something underneath the task itself. Maybe the material feels too large. Maybe you are afraid of trying and discovering a limit. Maybe you have been telling yourself a story about who you are and who you are not, and engaging deeply with this topic threatens to complicate that story. These are worth noticing, not fixing immediately, just noticing. Curie did not study in order to become a great scientist. She studied because she was already, in some fundamental way, someone who needed to understand the world. The identity came first.
even if quietly, even if unrecognized, and the behavior followed from it. This is what the behavioral researcher B.J. Fogg and, in a different frame, the philosopher of habit William James both point toward. Sustained behavior over time is not primarily a product of willpower, it is a product of identity. The person who exercises consistently does not white-knuckle their way to the gym every day. They have internalized, at some level, the identity of someone who moves. The person who reads widely does not force themselves through books. They think of themselves as someone who reads. This matters for learning because it shifts the question. The question stops being, how do I get myself to study, and becomes, who am I trying to become, and does this learning serve that becoming? That is not a motivational slogan. It is a practical reframe, and it is considerably more durable than motivation, which is famously unreliable. So what did Curie's system actually look like, translated into something applicable? She worked in focused blocks on single problems. She returned to material across multiple sessions rather than cramming. She trusted confusion as part of the process rather than treating it as a sign to stop. She kept detailed records of her thinking, not just her conclusions, which forced her to articulate her reasoning in a way that exposed gaps. She collaborated deeply with her husband, Pierre, treating conversation as a tool for thinking rather than just sharing results. Each of these translates directly. Study one thing at a time. Return to it tomorrow and try to reconstruct what you understood without looking. Write about what you are learning in your own words, not transcribed from a source, but generated from your own processing. Talk about it with someone who will ask you questions you cannot immediately answer. And when you encounter confusion, treat it as a location rather than a verdict. It tells you where the gap is. That is useful information. The goal is not to feel smart while you study. The goal is to have actually learned something by the time you close the notebook. So go back to that Tuesday evening, the paragraph you have read 4 times, the highlighter uncapped. That moment is not evidence of a broken mind. It is evidence of a mind that has not yet found the right relationship with this material, this session, this way of working. Curie sat in a frozen apartment with limited resources, a language she was still learning, and a field that had not yet decided whether to accept her. And she built something extraordinary, not through supernatural discipline, not through a gift no one else possesses, but through a relationship with learning that was honest, patient, and deeply curious. The truth at the center of all of this is simple. You do not study to prove that you are smart. You study to become someone who understands more than you did before. And that is a project that never requires genius. It only requires honesty and returning. If something in this video opened a question you did not expect, that's worth following. The next video in this series looks at what happens in your brain when you feel the specific frustration of forgetting something you thought you had learned, and why that experience, approached the right way, is actually one of the most powerful tools available to you. If that sounds like a conversation worth continuing, consider staying close. There is more here worth understanding.